All right. If you are interested in those tunes that we were playing, that's Everett's playlist that we curated for him, and it will be available at the end of the our discussion today. So make sure that you check that out on all of our socials. So welcome everybody. I'm going to give a brief introduction of myself. I'm going to be the moderator today. I have the distinct pleasure of being the moderator. My name is Gregory Street. And in addition to being the moderator for today's discussion, I'm also the president, our current president of the Central Texas NOMA chapter. Speaking of the presentation, I will save you my bio. So find me on social as needed if you're curious, and look me up post-presentation. Before we get going, I want to take a beat to acknowledge our platinum level sponsors, Indoor Weather Pros, Overland Partners Architecture and Urban Design, and Studio 8 Architects. Without those contributions, our ability to have events like these and carry out our mission and initiatives here in Central Texas wouldn't be possible. A little housekeeping, please make sure to keep all of your mics on mute. We'll do our best to control it on our end, but do us a favor. Also, if you have questions throughout the presentation or right now, be sure to drop them in the Q&A portion and not the chat. But if you would like AIA credit, because we will be reporting this, put your information, name, email, and AIA number in the chat for us, and we'll make sure to find that later and get you all other certificates or anything that you need. Again, your name, your email, and your AIA number. I think that's all the housekeeping. So let's introduce our speaker for today. Everett Fly is a native of San Antonio and resides in the city with his wife, Rosalinda, and is a licensed architect and landscape architect in Texas. Everett completed his undergraduate degree at the University of Texas at Austin in 1975, hook 'em. And in June of 1977, he became the first Black American to earn a master's degree in landscape architecture from Harvard University Graduate School of Design. Mr. Fly has held key roles in various interdisciplinary planning and design projects around the United States. His clients have included the National Park Service, the National Trust for Historic Preservation, municipal, state, and county governments, private foundations, and community development organizations as well. His project list includes the Texas State Capitol Extension and Preservation in Austin, Idlewild, Michigan Cultural Economic Development Readiness Initiative, America by Design with PBS, and extensive research and interpretation of the cultural landscape history of Eatonville, Florida for 30 years. Through this work, Mr. Fly has directly applied the Black settlements methodology and techniques to historic preservation projects in 17 states and the District of Columbia. He has lectured on various aspects of Black settlement research and preservation at academic and cultural institutions all across the country. In addition to his professional work, Mr. Fly has taught in the School of Architecture at the University of Texas at Austin from 1977 to 1982, the University of California at Berkeley in 1985, Texas A&M University Department of Landscape Architecture in 1986, and most recently served as an adjunct instructor in the Trinity University Department of History here in San Antonio. Mr. Fly has served on many boards and commissions over his 40-year career, from the Texas Historical Commission Board of Review for the National Register of Historic Places to his appointment by President Bill Clinton to the 34-member President's Committee on the Arts and Humanities. This committee work is essential to Everett's multidisciplinary process of working inside out and outside in. In 1995, Everett was elected a fellow of the American Society of Landscape Architects, the second Black American in the 115-year ASLA history And in 2014, in recognition of his lifetime commitment to research and preservation of cultural landscapes, President Barack Obama awarded Everett one of 10 2014 National Humanities Medals for his body of work preserving the integrity of African American places and landmarks. This is the highest honor the federal government can bestow upon an individual. Currently, Mr. Fly is in an advisory role to the Brackenridge Park Conservancy and is a strategic advisor for the San Antonio African American Community Archive and Museum, an organization which he co-founded in 2017 with Mr. George Frederick. To sum it all up, Everett is someone who should really need no introduction for us here in Central Texas, even though I just listed a whole page of things and that was condensed. But I'm thankful to be able to consider him a personal mentor and a friend of mine. And without further ado, I hope you all will help me in welcoming Everett Fly for our second installment of the Empower Our Speaker series. So Everett, feel free to share your screen and get going as you need.
How's that, Greg? Can everybody see the share? Okay, good. Thanks, Greg and Sophia and the others of the NOMA chapter for, and those of you who are on the line for making time to listen to this discussion. I consider it more of discussion, and I really, excuse me, enjoyed the question and answers. So I'll try not to stretch it out and be respectful of your time. Greg mentioned in the introduction about kind of my approach, my interdisciplinary approach, and that actually began when I was an architecture student at the University of Texas at Austin. I had the privilege to be there at a time when planning and architecture were in the same building. The architecture library was in the same building, and when I got to third year in architecture and we were asked to design whole buildings, I wanted to figure out how could I better place or site my buildings and make them relate to the land and the landscape. So Gerlinde Lighting Bettis gave me a reading list, and that's kind of where it all began. And as I talked to Greg about this presentation, and he asked me about examples to show, it came back to me about some of the memories, came back to me about some of the experiences that I had with the Texas Capitol. So that's going to be one of the examples, and then the other example will be some recent discoveries and work here in South Texas and in San Antonio. And I began to think about how long ago we did the Texas Capitol. It was 1989. And I know some of you may not have even been in this world yet, but I thought it might be interesting to share that with you and go from there. So quickly, as Greg outlined, I've always been interested in different topics, history and the humanities, but one way or another, no matter how hard or how little I tried, I seemed to come across or intersect these different disciplines: history, archaeology, folklore, food waste, sociology, urban studies, law, political science, digital technology, planning, environmental design, landscape architecture, and architecture. Some of these slides don't adjust your set. These are 30-year-old slides, so some of them have faded and they're not quite as clear as I would like, but you can see that this is where we started in 1989. You could literally park your car right at the front door of the Texas Capitol. And when I started in '89 on the project that was headed by Ford, Powell, and Carson from San Antonio and 3D International from Houston, there was even active archaeology at the bottom right, in progress on the site. So of course, one of our first requirements or tasks was to figure out where the existing trees were on the Capitol grounds. Some of you, again, it might be too young to remember, but there was a tree in Austin called the treaty oak, and someone had poisoned the treaty oak, and Governor Bill Clements was determined not to lose another oak tree on his watch. So Governor Clements specifically directed us to identify the trees that could be saved, as many of them as possible, and reinstalled in the Texas Capitol Extension. So many of you know the extension is an underground office building. So this is where we started with these charts and maps, and the orange dots are the trees that we finally decided to save. So we wound up saving 15 oak trees. The oaks turned out to be the best trees with likely health for succession, and we moved on from there. And then this was the kind of the sketch plan that the architects had me to work from. Of course, north is at the top, and that's Congress Avenue in the middle, and the skylights with an east and west axis are the skylights that provide daylighting down into the underground Capitol building. And so we had to get the site cleared, and these are some views of what it looked like right at the point of getting it cleared. At the right, you can see, I mean, this is literally how we did it. The Capitol Preservation Board hired Mr. Al Korenik from Houston, who is a well-known arborist and tree mover. And this was the only way we could figure out how to get these trees out and protect them and save them. So the slide on the right, you can see that's a crane lifting after excavating the oak tree. And again, that's probably like an 8 or 9 inch trunk diameter oak. And so we worked using cranes and tractors to get to the point where you see in the slide on the bottom left, which is cleared for excavation. And these are photographs of the excavation. The photograph at the left is the early stages, and you can actually see the limestone cut walls in the beginning of the construction. And then the cranes at the top right, and the substructure at the bottom right. You know how they talk about, you guys are probably familiar with through your work, Murphy's Law, whatever will happen, no matter how much planning you do. And so the slide at the left, about the time they got to this point or a little bit further, there was a huge storm in December of 1991. And of course that excavation is open, and it became inundated from that storm. And so that threw the schedule off at least 6 months. My job from the excavation of those trees was to keep them alive. Originally the plan was about 6 months to keep them alive and then reinstall them. But by this flood and inundation, it extended it to a year. So we had to keep the trees alive for about a year and a half before we could move them back on top of the excavation. And then of course, planning and working with the engineers to figure out, where we could, so to speak, load, where we could place the trees, and the structural support would do its job because we're planting on a roof. I include this slide. This was about 1991, late 91, early 92. So those are the box trees. Mr. Korenik came up with their 12 by 12 boxes. They weighed about 90,000 pounds a piece. And it was my job to keep them alive, kind of in the quadrant northeast of the campus grounds. I remember clearly because it was a regular occurrence. The architect of the Capitol, Alan McCree, his office was just off to the right of where I'm standing in this photograph. And so when Alan would come to work, I mean, he would literally look at the ground, and if he saw a bunch of leaves on the ground, he would call me and ask me, "Are the trees going to make it?" And so, in order to be proactive, for a year, roughly a year and a half, every 7 to 10 days, I drove to Austin, so that whenever Alan called, I was never more than 3 days of having visited the site. But he was literally counting the leaves on the trees that were falling. And any of you who have experience with oak trees know that they kind of shed in an ongoing manner. In other words, they don't just drop their leaves and stop. They're always losing a few leaves. Mr. Korenik, Al Korenik, also came up with a fertilizing formula. The white pipe you see in the foreground there, that tree is an irrigation line. So each tree had an irrigation line. There was a timer. We had a schedule, and we would inject or supply the trees with fertilizer and root hormones as they needed. The Capitol staff was so concerned that they even gave or assigned me a staff member. So I had a person on the ground that I could always call and ask them to go check, whatever it was, the irrigation, the status, how did the tree look, et cetera. And again, that went on for about a year and a half. And then we began to move the trees back to the roof. The photograph at the top left, the gentleman in the orange or yellow hard hat, that's Al Korenik. The top right is the lady that's sitting there at the corner is Dealey Herndon. She was the chair of the Capitol Preservation Board at the time. So you can see how much scrutiny we were under, in order to make this a success. And then you can see in the bottom left the size of the tractor that it took to lift those trees and move them. And then, of course, the media had lots of fun. When we put the trees back, they ran this article in the Austin American Statesman, Capitol's Potted Oak Trees Transplanted. Again, we had 15 trees. We kept 15 alive for the year and a half, and we didn't lose a single tree. And we were able to get the Capitol, this is a similar view, of course, older, that you would see when you would visit. But the middle there, of course, was specifically designed to meet the load requirements and limits of the central atrium of the Capitol. So it was quite an experience to get to work with Ford, Powell, and Carson, and Boone, Powell, and the others, and 3D International. But then the process, it was always an ongoing process. We were always in ongoing communication about, as these different issues and problems came up, how to resolve them as a team. Most of the trees were placed where we had planned, but as we went through the project, the engineers became concerned about, weight limits and things like that. So we were never able to use the crane to put the trees back. We had to use the tractors and kind of work from the perimeter of that central atrium and work towards the middle. So it was quite a gratifying project, and needless to say, quite a challenging project. And gives me great pride as a Texas architect and landscape architect to be able to contribute. Recently, I've been working in San Antonio, kind of an accidental discovery. This is Major Mike White, the photograph at the top left, who lives in a suburban neighborhood of San Antonio. And Major Wright, um, in taking his children to school, to his right, the left of that top left photograph, that's an elementary school. And Major Wright discovered that that overgrown lot that he's looking at was a cemetery. And Major Wright, of course, is U.S. Air Force retired. This gentleman, he was a fighter pilot and had no idea what this overgrown lot meant or was. He just knew it was in his neighborhood and needed to be taken care of. And so Major Wright began to do research, and he found the plat that you see at the bottom right of your screen. And sure enough, in the plat around the residential lots, in the middle is labeled a cemetery. And at the top right is a Google aerial that shows the outline of the cemetery and the residential lots. And it turned out that this cemetery was actually dedicated by a former enslaved family, African-American enslaved family, that bought land in this area in the 1870s. And we don't know how they got the money to buy this land coming out of slavery, but they bought more than 100 acres of land. And they had enough civic foresight to dedicate the cemetery for use by African Americans. And so Major Wright, I had never met Major Wright. He called and asked if I would help him figure out how to recover this overgrown lot and what we could do to move forward so that it would be a benefit to everyone. So in 2016, we started at the top left. The lady at the far left is, at the time, she was the president of the Conservation Society of San Antonio. The lady in the middle is Kay Hines. She's the former city of San Antonio archaeologist. And then, of course, you can see how overgrown the lot was and what challenges we had. And then, of course, Major Wright there at the bottom right. So once we found the deed descriptions for the land, and we can verify that that was the property, the City of San Antonio Solid Waste Management offered to help us out. And the image there at the top left is the closest street. It's about 150 yards from the cemetery. Solid Waste told us that if we could haul the brush out to that street, they would bring the big dump truck and the claw and pick it up. Over 2018 and 2019, we picked up more than 300 cubic yards of brush. October of 2018, we had a community cleanup, and that was enough to get us started. But we had more than 100 volunteers from all over the city of San Antonio to come and work with us and help us out. And members of the San Antonio African American Community Archive and Museum helped us organize the cleanup. Once we began to get things kind of clean where we could see the ground, we did find some artifacts, and that's what these photographs represent. Unfortunately, the cemetery had been desecrated. The headstones had been picked up, literally picked up and carried away. And so we really don't have a carved headstone in the traditional way that we can use as a reference. But I was able to get the Texas A&M at College Station Heritage and Conservation organization to come, and the Professor Mark Everett in the photograph at the right from the geology department, and they brought their ground penetrating radar equipment and used it as an example or a case study for the class. And then at the top left, this gentleman here is City Councilman Clayton Perry, the cemetery is in Clayton's district, and so he was able to help out, with things like the city permit, the solid waste management, and it did not hurt that Councilman Perry was an alumni of A&M at College Station, so he made sure that whatever the team needed, they got. We also got the Heritage and Conservation team to bring their LiDAR, light detection and ranging equipment. And what we were trying to do, we're still trying to do, is overlay the GPR data with the LiDAR data and see if we can figure out where the graves might have been located. We do have death certificates that clearly say Hockley Cemetery. So we know at least 12 to 15 people by public record death certificate that are located there. But the family, as we did oral history, they told us that there were many more graves than that. We were also able to get the UTSA Center for Archaeological Resources to do a detailed, what they call surface archaeological investigation. And in their report, they found this series of aerial photographs from 1929 to 1986. And they trace the vegetation, the changes in the vegetation coverage for the site. And then we were able to get family members, believe it or not, these two gentlemen are brothers. On the left is Zelder Clay, and on the right is Velmo Clay. Zelder's in his early 90s. And they remembered going out to the, as they call it, the farm when they were young men. And so once we got the site cleared, I was able to get them out and walk them around and ask them what they remembered. And they provided quite a bit of information, including the information about, that there being more graves than what was shown in the death certificates. And when we got to the point in the slide on the bottom right, when we got to that point in the site, they paused and they said, there's something not quite in line here. And they said that they remembered the fence in the background, of course, was not there. And they felt like, from memory, that the cemetery had extended beyond where that fence is. And they also told me that their great-great-grandmother, Jane Warren, who's the lady that set aside the cemetery, that she had a cattle brand. So we were able to go to the Bexar County Spanish Archives and find Jane Warren's cattle brand certificate. We don't know the significance of the YOK or what it meant, but I just got kind of like a flash of an idea to put it on a cap and use it as we work on the recovery of this cemetery. The drone photograph here was taken, of course, once we got the site cleared, and you can see this kind of irregular fence line, which again gave us another clue that there was some encroachments on the property. And fortunately, my registered surveyor that I do commercial work with volunteered to do a boundary and corner survey. And Gibbons Survey is the name of the company. And when they did the survey, they found this piece in here, the two pieces here, 6,000 square feet that had actually encroached into the cemetery. So it took some negotiation with the two homeowners here and here, because they had bought the property thinking that they owned this land, but the unfortunate part was that they bought the property without a survey. And so once we got the Gibbons survey, we were able to cross-reference. We were actually able to go down to the city plat office and cross-reference the plat that they had on file there. And sure enough, it turned out that the Gibbons survey was correct, that this line here was an illegal encroachment, and the actual property line was to the south. So one property owner had encroached to more than 5,200 feet, and the other property owner had encroached about 800 square feet into the cemetery. So after quite a bit of negotiation, more than a year, we were able to get the property owner that had the largest piece. He had actually built a shed, started building a shed, which would have been into the cemetery. And so we actually moved the shed by hand. You can see in the photographs there, and then had a new fence erected. You can see the top left here and the top left here. And when you look in either of the photographs, you can see the area, how much land was in the encroachment. And so in February of this year, we were finally able to get that new fence located in the proper place. And then this view is from the far south end of the cemetery looking north. And the posts, you can see those were the encroached, the posts that were on the encroached property line. So the goal to get this encroached land back is so that the entire cemetery could be designated as a historic heritage cemetery, because it was the last family owner of the Hockley Clay family that lived on the land was 1975. So they lived on this land for more than 100 years. And some of their relatives are buried in this cemetery. And again, we have the death certificates, et cetera, census records to verify that. And that gives us enough to start with a local San Antonio designation and a state of Texas designation. Those are the two projects that I'd like to kind of put on your mind. And I'm sure you've been seeing things in the media, that these cemeteries are being discovered all over the United States, not just here in Texas. They just happen to be landscapes. They might not be the traditional things that we think of as parks and playgrounds and things like that, but they do count as landscapes, and they're important not just for the people who are buried there, but you saw the two gentlemen that I showed you, Mr. Bellmill and Zelder Clay. It's an important landscape for them, and they have said that they feel like it's kind of like a closure for them to get this property back. Last but not least, what I'd like to do is I'd like to encourage you to network, use this opportunity that you set up with NOMA to network. I was talking to Greg as I prepared this presentation, and was telling him when I was growing up and finishing my studies at the University of Texas at Austin, the only way we got to see a Black or Hispanic architect or engineer was to go to the conferences. And NOMA had they were very active in the 1980s, late 70s, early 80s. And I can vividly remember, I mean, literally going to conferences in Philadelphia, Washington, DC. I think I even went to one in Chicago, a NOMA conference. And it was just inspiring to see professionals of color, and they presented themselves well and represented their communities well. I wish I could tell you that the playing field is level now, but it really isn't. and you all have an opportunity to use. We were laughing as we set up this webinar. You have all these tools. You can Zoom, you can talk to people on the phone, on your handheld phone. Use it as an opportunity, build your networks. You'll be surprised what you learn, not just socially, but professionally, what you learn from talking with one another and sharing with one another. And so I hope you'll, again, use that opportunity and, do great things, like the Capitol project. I never imagined in my wildest dream that I would ever get to work on something like that. One quick digression about that, I told Greg about it. The first few times that I went to the Capitol grounds, I mean, I went to work. I mean, Ford Powell and Carson Boone Powell and the others, they said, this is your part of the project. You got to handle it. You go do it. And the first few times I went, of course, I had on my boots and my hard hat, and I had trouble getting in to the Capitol grounds because the guards didn't believe that I was a professional person, in charge of, taking care of those trees. And so it took a few a few phone calls and Alan McCree having to call people and explain that I was really a professional on the project, and cut that stuff out. so so how they say, some things have changed and some things haven't. But I really, again, want to encourage you, and I thank you for giving me this time. And I'll stop rambling, Greg, and you can pick it up with whatever questions you might have and whatever others might have. Thanks.
Yeah, so one question that just came up was if you could show that last slide again. I think some people are wanting to grab your contact information. So if you can do that while I sort of tee up our discussion, I think that would be awesome. So you mentioned, how some things, change, but other things continue to stay the same. I know you have another story about something similar something similar happening to you more in the contemporary. And we don't have to discuss it here, but I guess I can start us off by asking, like, this is the Empower Speaker series. And so my first question would be, given all of those, things that you have to deal with and negotiate and kind of understand as part of your lived experiences, at what point was it the Capitol, or was it the, some of your other work with the cemeteries? When did you really feel like you came into your power as a professional and you were able to kind of move through space with some agency and authority, a little bit less tethered by some of those things that you were mentioning before, do you feel like you fully come into that? I know I think about that often, being a young professional, and I'm sure there are folks on the call who think about that too. Like, when do I really get into my rhythm? When will I find my flow? And how will I find my flow? I know your process has been very interdisciplinary, and so I think that's probably helped you be able to step back and have those creative touch points to be able to find what really aligns with you. But I'd be curious to know, like, when did you really feel like you were sort of working in alignment with your creative talents and your profession and your interests and all of those other things, to start us off?
I'm sorry if you need me to put the slide back in a minute, I will. I just want to make sure I wasn't on mute. So I guess your question about finding your flow. I mean, I had a in relative terms, I had a good experience at the University of Texas at Austin, but I have to be honest and tell you, when I I went to the Graduate School of Design at Harvard, and I guess in my second year, my some of my professors began to tell me or encourage me that, you know, you've got the talent to do A, B, C, you should do it. And there was one professor in particular, I've talked about him recently in a number of occasions. His name was J.B. Jackson, John Brinkerhoff Jackson. And I mean, you had to know this guy was somebody, because it was kind of like the Paper Chase movie. I mean, he taught in this big lecture hall, um, right, I mean, literally on the Harvard yard. And there's like 200 students in there. And once I turned in, I had to do a term paper for Jackson. And once I turned the paper in, I was just trying to do the paper and get out of there. and I turned the paper in, and Jackson, he taught at Harvard in the fall, and he taught at Berkeley in the spring, and then he'd alternate back and forth like that. And so when he came back the next fall, Jackson started calling me. He's like, "Come to my office, I need to talk to you." And at that point, Greg, that's when I began, I said, well, something's up. This guy wouldn't, this professor, this distinguished scholar, et cetera, author, he wouldn't be asking me questions or encouraging me, you know, just, you know, out of these hundreds of students that he had. And so that's where it began. He kept saying, you know, you got to keep working on, he really liked what I was doing with the Black settlements research and connecting the history and culture of people to a place. And he just kept encouraging me and encouraging me and encouraging me. And then the humanities, when I got involved in the humanities in the 1980s, the State Humanities Council, I guess that was the next step. And again, Greg, I wasn't targeting, you know, these as steps. It was just people suggested or nominated or recommended me, and it just kind of built from there. And then, of course, you know, I have to be honest again. In '94, when I was nominated to the President's Committee on the Arts and the Humanities, again, I didn't apply for that or say I want to do that. Somebody nominated me for that. I thought they were joking. I thought, you made a mistake, you know, because I'm not a PhD. I don't have, you know, all these things.
Mhm.
And it just built from there. And so once I got to, it was a working committee. It was a working group. And once I got, you know, into the group and into the discussion, people were very respectful. You know, they encouraged me to give ideas and thoughts and participate. And so by the 90s and the President's Committee, that's when I really realized, like you said, I had hit my, kind of found my groove and, you know, the kind of people that I could work with.
Got it. Okay. So it was more you kind of filling in gaps and then saying yes to opportunities that
Right,
presumably had your name on them, right? And like
right,
nobody else could seemingly fit into that space. And so you just had to say yes to things that were coming your way and doing the due
right.
diligence to make it happen.
Yeah.
That's good. So you mentioned the National Humanities Board or commission that you were on. We have a question in the chat, and I want to get to that because I think it's a cool story about your 2014 National Humanities Medal award and kind of what that was like, and just sort of happenstance how all of those things came together and converged.
Kind of how, like you say, how did it converge? Or
Yeah,
so,
like what?
okay, so
Just speak a bit
but
about the
so
experience.
so it ties in with your earlier question. So by the time the humanities nomination came, as I said, I had served on the President's Committee for the Arts and Humanities for 7 years. I had served on the Humanities Texas Board, the State Humanities Board, for 11 years. And, you know, that was just my goal, was to serve. And uh, it was the same thing, Greg. I got a call from somebody in another state, and they said, I want to nominate you for something. and but you got to send your information. You know, it's the architect's deadline thing. You got to send your information like overnight and as much as you can. But they wouldn't tell me what it was. They didn't tell me what the nomination was. And so I sent the material in. It was literally, let me see, I want to say almost a year. You know, I just sent it in and forgot about it. And almost a year. And one day, it was in the spring of 2015, I got a message, and the gentleman in the message says, "I'm calling from the White House." Okay. Now I've worked on the President's Committee before, so I know that if you get a message, you know, the area code 202, that, and they say it's the White House, it's the White House. Okay.
Pick
So,
up.
right. So I call back, and the gentleman, he still wouldn't tell me what the position or the award, the nomination was. He just said that I had made the final cut, and that they were going to do the last. I know it sounds eerie and, you know, Big Brother and all that, but he said they were going to do the last FBI background check. And so that's the second, you know, it's like, it's really serious.
How did you get past that?
So, and he said, you can't tell anybody. Okay. So that other than my wife, nobody knew. And so then I waited. And then the next call was from, I guess it was about 2 months or so, 3 months, 2.5, 3 months. The next call was from the office of the chairman of the National Endowment for the Humanities. And then that's when they began to explain that I had been nominated for the National Humanities Medal. They were working on the details of the, you know, scheduling the event, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But you can't tell anybody. so that it just went from there. And so I guess about a month before the September ceremony, they finally sent a package, a FedEx package arrived with access credentials, you know, all that kind of thing, to get instructions, et cetera, to get into the White House. And you know, then it was at that point that they explained it was a National Humanities Medal. And they said, if you want the medal, you got to come. You can't just say, send it to me. You got to come. So Rosalinda and I got on the plane and headed to DC. And that, I'll never forget, the day before the event, when we got off the plane, I had like 5 voice messages: call the White House. And they wanted to know, you know, could they mention could President Obama mention some of my accomplishments in his introductory talk? And of course, I'm not going to say no. But I did have to wrestle with them a little bit. Just a quick background story. The person that called wanted to just call me a landscaper.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, no, I had to go to school and take a test and exam and internship to get that license. So if you're going to mention that, it's got to be landscape architect. And landscape architect is not the same as architect.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, the licensing and the education. So I had to explain all that to them. And anyway, it worked out. And you know, we got to meet the president and the first lady and the other recipients. It was clearly one of the more humbling experiences you know, that I'd ever been through.
Very good. Yeah, I think I mean, that just being a culmination of all of the work that you've done, in committee, out of committee, and kind of in between. I'm getting a lot of questions in the Q&A, particularly about landscape architecture school, why you went, that kind of typical question. So I think we can come back to that.
Okay.
First, I want to ask specifically about the cemeteries in particular. And I want to ask you, what do you think the future is of that particular type of work? And how do you see it being able to be leveraged to not only connect, um, you know, people with their loved ones who happen to be departed, but also people who still live today amongst each other, being able to find their relatives and reference points and really their identity through that process. It's probably like two questions, but I think you get what I'm what I'm
Well,
trying to.
there's, I believe there's lots of work to be done. There's a draft bill uh, up in Washington, somewhere in Washington, um, in the Department of Interior, excuse me, that would create a database, a national database of historic African American burial grounds across the United States. And as far as I can see, we don't have enough experienced and trained folks to deal with it. But there's thousands of these cemeteries, lost, abandoned, etc., across the United States. And so I see a lot of work, a lot of opportunities, lots of opportunities for folks from the Park Service on back to like what we're trying to do here uh, in San Antonio. So the second part of your question to that was, you said, do I see opportunities, and what was the other?
Uh, Basically, just trying to get an understanding of what you think the future of the work is,
Oh,
and
so,
it doesn't
so the
even,
yes, so
connecting family
so
members together.
it's by coincidence, San Antonio has a very progressive, what would I say, historic preservation interest. Historic preservation is a really big deal in San Antonio. And inside a loop 410, it's hard to get anything built without going through the checklist for historic preservation. At least you have to check and say there's nothing here. And so I think we're gonna find ourselves, as our cities, not just San Antonio, but as other cities grow, we're going to encounter these, I call them sacred places, these burial grounds and other places. And I think there could be some real interesting and inspiring routes for design. It's just that we architects, designers, landscape architects, we haven't applied ourselves to this, if you want to call it a genre or diaspora, whatever the words they're using now. But again, the things that I've seen and been learning as I've worked on this, they do inspire me, to think of new ways, new expressions, creative expressions, and respectful expressions to incorporate these places, sacred places, into our designs.
Okay, let me go. Let me see here what we have in the chat. So you started going into a little bit of how you think, we will incorporate some of those sacred spaces into our everyday. San Antonio in particular has a very deep history of landscapes that happen to be cemeteries. Particularly, I'm thinking particularly on the east side, but also your work at Hockley that's further up north. Do you have any kind of ideas about what that looks like that you'd be willing to unpack with us today, or is it?
Well, we could
Yeah.
start a little bit, and I know we all have different experiences, but um, I consider myself to be when they say classically trained, in other words, uh, we had to study at least my time at UT at Austin, we had to study the the classic styles, Beaux-Arts, Renaissance, Baroque, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But when you look at these, especially some of these African American places, um, there's a vernacular quality and essence to them. The everyday person built this or laid this out, etc. And those vernacular qualities don't always follow, the classical traditional styles, etc. And everything from the use of materials across the South, for example. I've seen Black cemeteries where they use seashells for patterns on grave coverings and even headstones. At the Hockley, we're pretty sure that some of those crosses, the few little crosses that we found, were handmade by an African American blacksmith, because the census records show us that there were more than one African American blacksmith that lived within a mile of that cemetery. Mm-hmm. So, but nobody's ever made an effort to like track down that blacksmith. What was their work like? What did they do or include? And there were probably some other kinds of craftspeople as well. And so I think that would give us some interesting clues, some interesting inspirations, some interesting opportunities. And in the census records in San Antonio, Bexar County, we even have found, there were a number of African American stone masons, but we just haven't, again, had the time or whatever to be able to track down and say, okay, what did they carve, and what was their inspiration, and what was their style, vernacular style.
Yeah, so really this is also, I guess, part of the process of telling a more complete history, right? And
right.
We've gotten into that before. Like, an incomplete history is not, the real history.
Right.
You have to have it be complete, and that means you have to include a larger cross section of reference points and things for people to see. So I think that begins to speak to another one of the questions that we're getting in the chat, and sort of what are some of those reference points that you use in your work to help kind of make them unique or specific to those that exist on the margins, and those who their work is consistently covered over and erased and removed from discussion and sort of common language.
Well, I showed in the presentation the discussion with the oral history with the two brothers, Elder Clay and Velmill, and I feel like there's a lot of opportunity in that oral history. I always laugh because like when I started talking to those two brothers, they said, "Oh, well, we don't know anything. we can't. We don't know anything." But once I got them out there on the site and they started walking around, the memories and recollections and came back. And like Zelder told me that he helped put up some of the fence posts at the cemetery, like in the 1940s. And he said that he told me how they would dig the graves, how they would schedule it. He even told me that many of the graves they dug at night because these were working people, and so when they get through uh, their regular day job, a group of them would gather up and take their trucks or whatever they had and their tools. And he said they would literally use the headlights of the trucks to, so they could see where they were digging and, that kind of thing. But in other cases, the oral history of folks, it's really been amazing. I've absolutely been amazed at how much information they actually do have. Uh, it's kind of like a multi-step process. Is, you do your homework kind of in the traditional manner, whatever you can find in uh, uh, public records and newspaper documents and then that kind of thing. But then if you can get those family members or community members to sit down with you and compare notes. We found one of the other cemeteries that we found out north, uh, the Winters Cemetery. Mr. Dan Winters, at first, same thing. He said he couldn't remember, anything. But once I got into, I said, okay, Mr. Dan, how did you go to the cemetery? Which direction, which road? He could remember all of that. And it turned out that the cemetery is near the intersection of Loop 1604 and Nacogdoches Road. So when they built Loop 1604, that cut off Mr. Dan's landmarks, what he could remember seeing as landmarks. But he gave me enough information that, going back and looking at historic maps, Greg, I literally got within about 200 yards of the cemetery just by what he had described, the hills and the road and, that kind of thing. So the oral history is real important. I think there's a lot to be harvested from that.
I see. So I guess that also goes into kind of the work that you were talking about previously and how you came upon the cattle brands, right? And then leveraged those cattle brands
Right.
to make a physical product, which is quite creative. We kind of breezed over it in the presentation, but that's one of the kind of working, perhaps more contemporary, future focused ways that you have been able to leverage some authority, like in the marketplace, to get people to understand the work that you're talking about,
Right.
And kind of what you do, and to create some space, right, for that
Right.
to be made relevant. So I don't know, maybe unpack that a little bit with the brands and the products, um, and sort of the whole process of digging into the archives and everything.
Well, again, try to be brief, but my grandfather had a little farm up in East Texas, and so he had a cattle brand. And just from that personal experience, it made me curious about these other folks, in Bexar County. And of course, we're so fortunate in Bexar County. We have the Bexar County Spanish Archives. So they have cattle brands that go back to Spanish colonial settlement time period. And Dr. David Carlson, the archaeologist or archivist there, was, kind enough to not only show me how to find them online, but pre-COVID, he would let me come in and go through the register books. And again, it's a matter of connecting the dots. And you find a name on a cattle brand. Sometimes they would mention that it's on Cibolo Creek or a geographic location. And then you can use census records to see if you can find a person with that name in that vicinity. And then suddenly you've got a story. You're starting to build a story behind that, behind that brand. And again, once again, it's been that until this came along, nobody thought about the significance of African Americans in Bexar County, what that meant if you had a cattle brand. That, that meant even if it was a small scale, you were part of, what today they'd say the agribusiness, the cattle business, the trading, et cetera.
Right.
And even if it was just enough of livestock for your family to survive, you were still in it. And but those ones in the 1870s and 80s, I mean, like Miss Jane Warren's, it's 14 miles from where her land is to downtown. And
Right.
so for her to have the courage and the will, like, I'm going to get my brand filed downtown, it really tells you something. So anyway, it just kept building upon and building upon. And then I was trying to think of a way to, as you say, get folks to think about it.
Hmm.
And, of course, looking at the kind of modern context, and lots of young people wear caps. And
Right.
so a friend of mine said, well, if he could put that on a cap. And the first day I wore the Jane Warren cap, I went to a restaurant,
Right.
to fast food, to pick up. And I walked up to the counter with the cap, and the young lady behind the counter said, "That's a funny looking symbol. What is that?"
Yep.
And that's all you want. It opened the door, and I could, just give her a little snippet and say, "This is a brand of a former enslaved woman from the 1870s."
Right.
And make her think. So I just think we have to find, like I say, innovative and creative ways to help tell these stories, provoke thought, remind people, uh, and to me, it's kind of like giving honor
Right.
to the efforts of those folks.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful. And I think that begins to sort of encapsulate a lot of the ways that, uh, or the questions that we're getting right now is like, okay, how do you do this work? How do you advocate for this work? How do you create space, and all of those other things? Like, you have to be creative, right?
Yeah,
Is
right.
the bottom line. You have to bring your creative thinking and your creative process to that work that seems to be, you know, um, something that that may not always be at the front of mind, right now. So I think that's really good, and that's like the perfect example of what your process, how your process is driven, Everett, through your work.
Yeah,
It's sort of working inside out, right, and back outside in. It's thinking about the issue, coming back across the issue, and then trying to contextualize it a
right.
little more in the contemporary. And don't let me fill in any gaps that you don't think need to
No,
be.
it no, it's
Stop me if I'm overstating, but that's how I'm synthesizing your kind of unique process for working on this kind of, um, working in this kind of area.
yeah.
So, and I know that it's not always easy work for sure. Like,
Oh,
I know there's like different levels. Me and a lot of my friends talk about the different levels of joy that you have. You're like, okay, your advocacy work, like, it's cool. It's not always the most fun. That would be like medium or lower level fun, right? And then high level fun would be something maybe where that's a little less heavy. You don't have to think so much. So I'm curious, Everett, what really brings you legit joy? Like, when are you, besides listening to your playlist, that's, amazing. What brings you joy in this age, and levity, and helps you to get through, right now?
well, the I'm still laughing about the playlist. Um, Again, when I came along, your age, younger, etc. Um, I'm trying to think, because I don't want to. It was very, very, very rare that anybody mentioned or said anything about. Let me go back. Said anything about Black people in design.
Hmm.
And so when again, like I said, when I got to the Graduate School of Design, that paper that I wrote for John B. Jackson was just that. It was just like kind of to prove to myself or not that Black folks had done or not something in design. Jackson had written a book called American Space, and you know how I've forgotten how many editions had sold out, and but the only thing he said about Black folks was that they worked in plantations, and he did mention, he said that there were a few towns or a few places in the South where they had formed settlements.
Mhm.
And so that was it was kind of like a rebellious challenge to Jackson. I said, can I write my paper about that? I thought he was going to say no. And then I could say, yeah, see, I told you, you know. But he said, you can write the paper. And he said that he said, I'll help you. Uh, uh, I'll give you a pass to the rare books collection in the Widener Library at Harvard. Okay,
Mhm.
that's like that's like being turned loose in Disneyland, you know, for for research.
Right.
And so I started finding these pieces, and it was, that was one of the, like I said, Greg, the aha moments.
Mhm.
You know, I started finding these pieces about these separate settlements and towns. And so what gives me joy now, it's like whatever, however many decades later, I can still say, I told you so. We did do something, and it does make a difference. And so, um, you know, like when Major Wright, I could tell when Major Mike Wright came with his initial research for the Hockley that there was something to it.
Mhm.
And I thought initially it was just going to be, you know, recovering getting the brush out of there and recovering it. But when I found the encroachments, you know, that the two neighbors had encroached 6,000 square feet into the cemetery, then it was like, I'm going to help this family get this land back, because I know from my professional work, you know, you got to have a survey, and you got to, you know, honor the, you know, the easements, the setback, the survey lines, etc. And you know, it's kind of like a equity and social justice.
Right.
So whenever I can help a family like that, uh, you know, like I said, that I'm in. And then if I, you know, like we got the fence moved, and then I'm really in. I'm like really overjoyed. And you're right, Greg. It's not, this is not for the faint of heart.
Mhm.
I mean, many times you know how they say, it's harrowing. It's nerve wracking. It's traumatic. It's you know, all those things. But if you can use it, for me, if I can use it to help somebody in the community or help a family, then I'm really happy.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I'm glad that you've been able to find joy in that work, and that is like high level and legit. You know, from myself, joy for you, because that's, as I've talked to people that are more in your generation than mine, like that's actually kind of a novel thought. Is that you know, that you would actually be experiencing your work and have that actually bring you joy, and it's kind of this reciprocal thing. It's like, no, you work to pay the bills, versus, you know, kind of what we're discussing here, which is like, no, the work actually brings me joy and it's life-giving,
Right.
and that's why
Yeah.
I do it, even
Yeah.
when you know, even when the money's not right, or anything else. So I guess we got like 9 minutes left, and I know your work isn't done yet. Um, but another thing that is sort of happening right now, particularly in the chat, and one of my legit curiosities is like, what do you want your legacy to be? Um, and like, how do you want people to consider your body of work and this amazing research that you've been able to accumulate over your career, and like all the accolades and everything? um you know, like what excites you about that, and where do you see it landing, or where do you hope it lands?
Well, like right now, I do have several I guess you might call them projects that are kind of in the works, and they do follow the pattern of either helping a community or enlightening a community. Excuse me. And so that's what I would hope, if you want to call it legacy, that people would look back and say this helped us understand. Everett's work helped us understand how different cultures intersect, how different cultures, especially in America, reinforce and inspire one another, and hopefully that we can do more than what Everett did, because there's so much, there is so much literally to be done. I mean, I can't begin to tell you. I have like there's one town, and it's a Black town, and they have a school building that's probably, I know it's hard to imagine, but it's almost an acre inside. It's like 30 or 40,000 square feet, and they happen to be in one of those. They've been talking about it recently. One of those technology dead zones.
Right.
But if we could figure out a way to use that school, repurpose that school to help that community technologically connect, or have be a resource where they can connect with the rest of the world. There's things that they could do, and ways that they can sustain that town. And so if those kind of things would come out of my work, that would be terrific. Of course, there's you mentioned Eatonville. They have a similar situation, but they have, I want to say it's close to 100 acres of land that the town set aside in the 1880s for education of their African-American students. And they're wrestling with outsiders that want to take the land away from them and build luxury car dealerships on it and stuff like that. Right. And I'm trying to get the town to understand how important that land is, just as an asset, much less how important it is, for education and community progress. So right. Those would be some of my kind of dreams,
moving yeah. Past today, yeah. what the dream, what you felt people would be able to look at your work and kind of reflect back to you and continue, right, and pick up the mantle and continue that work when you're tired of doing it.
Right, exactly.
which can happen. Well, Everett, this has been awesome. I'm going to ask, we're getting pretty close on time. If you have any parting, last thoughts or words that you want to share with us?
Well, again, just to thank you, Greg, and thank you all for listening. And I wasn't expecting this many people to be listening in, but I hope it's worthwhile. And again, I keep saying I really want to encourage you to build from this network. There's so much, you may not realize it, but there's so much that you all can do, believe it or not, in this networking. And when I saw Greg, it's been a few years ago, and we were talking, and I explained to him, I think it was Greg and Diami, and might have been one other person, and myself, and we were in a room in San Antonio, and I said, do you realize that just the presence of the 4 or 5 of us here increases, there's been a 600% increase in the number of Black architects in San Antonio. I mean, when I started, uh, you know, and I give great respect. When I started, the only Black architect in San Antonio was Norcell Haywood,
Mhm.
and he really had to struggle to, you know, get work and opportunities and you know, that kind of thing. And he kind of laid the groundwork. He and John Chase and some others, John Chase in Houston, laid the groundwork for Black engineers, architects of color. And it's just an opportunity, and it's a change. But like I said, the playing field's not level yet, and pull together as much as you can.
Right. That's the plan, definitely within Central Texas, us trying to kind of get those feelers out and do something
All
more
right.
sustaining than ourselves. So we're at 128. Again, thank you everybody for joining us today. I also want to thank our sponsors again, but also Ingrid and Sophia, our board folks. Questions, background, Everett's playlist that is happening right now will be available via our socials. But if you're curious more about our mission here in Central Texas and kind of what it is that we're trying to accomplish, our initiatives, our socials, for another everybody. All right. We got participants leaving. And lots of thanks to you, Everett, in the chat. So
All right.
I think that was great. Thanks so much
Okay.
for joining me.
Thank you. Yeah, we'll talk soon.
Yeah, we'll come back and we'll talk soon. And there may be some questions that I missed, but it was, you know, moving warp speed. I'll try
You're
to.
right. I know.
I'll try to save the chat and maybe we can get you to answer some of these questions and get it back to folks.
Right. Okay.
In the future. So I appreciate it, Everett. Thank you.
Okay. See ya.
Bye.